National Semiconductor was an American semiconductor manufacturer which specialized in analog devices and subsystems, formerly headquartered in Santa Clara, California, United States. The company produced power management integrated circuits, display drivers, audio and operational amplifiers, communication interface products and data conversion solutions. National's key markets included wireless handsets, displays and a variety of broad electronics markets, including medical, automotive, industrial and test and measurement applications. On September 23, 2011, the company formally became part of Texas Instruments as the Silicon Valley division. History. Founding. National Semiconductor was founded in Danbury, Connecticut by Dr. Bernard J. Rothlein on May 27, 1959, when he and 7 colleagues, Edward N. Clark, Joseph J. Gruber, Milton Schneider, Robert L. Hopkins, Robert L. Hodge, Richard N. Rao and Arthur V. Siffert, left their employment at the Semiconductor division of Sperry Rand Corporation. The founding of the new company was followed by Sperry Rand filing a lawsuit against National Semiconductor for patent infringement. By 1965, as it was reaching the courts, the preliminaries of the lawsuit had caused the stock value of National to be depressed. The depressed stock values allowed Peter J. Sprague to invest heavily in the company with Sprague's family funds. Sprague also relied on further financial backing from a pair of West Coast investment firms and a New York underwriter to take control as the chairman of National Semiconductor. At that time Sprague was 27 years old. Jeffrey S. Young characterized the era as the beginning of venture capitalism. That same year National Semiconductor acquired Melectro. Melectro was founded in 1962, in Santa Clara, California by J. Nall and D. Spittlehouse, who were formerly employed at Fairchild Camera and Instrument Corporation. The acquisition also brought to National Semiconductor 2 experts in linear semiconductor technologies, Dave Talbot and Robert Widler, who were also formerly employed at Fairchild. The acquisition of Melectro provided National with the technology to launch itself in the fabrication and manufacture of monolithic integrated circuits. In 1967, Sprague hired 5 top executives away from Fairchild, among whom were Charles E. Spork and Pierre Lamond. At the time of Spork's hiring, Robert Noyce was de facto head of semiconductor operations at Fairchild and Spork was his operations manager. Spork was appointed president and CEO of National. To make the deal better for Spork's hiring and appointment for half his former salary at Fairchild, Spork was allotted a substantial share of National's stock. In essence, Spork took 4 of his personnel from Fairchild with him as well as 3 others from TI, PerkinElmer and Hewlett-Packard to form a new 8-man team at National Semiconductor. Incidentally, Spork had been Widler's superior at Fairchild before Widler left Fairchild to join Melectro due to a compensation dispute with Spork. In 1968, National shifted its headquarters from Danbury, Connecticut to Santa Clara, California. However, like many companies, National retained its registration as a Delaware corporation, for legal and financial expediency. Over the years National Semiconductor acquired several companies like Fairchild Semiconductor, and Cyrix. However, over time National Semiconductor spun off these acquisitions. Fairchild Semiconductor became a separate company again in 1997 and the Cyrix Microprocessors division was sold to Via Technologies of Taiwan in 1999. From 1997 to 2002, National enjoyed a large amount of publicity and awards with the development of the Cyrix Media Center, Cyrix WebPad, WebPad Metro and National Origami PDA concept devices created by National's Conceptual Products Group. Based largely on the success of the WebPad, National formed the Information Appliance Division in 1998. The Information Appliance Division was sold to AMD in 2003. Other business like digital wireless chipsets, image sensors, PCIO chipsets have also been recently closed down or sold off as National has reincarnated itself as a high-performance analog semiconductor company. The transformation of National Semiconductor. Peter Sprague, Pierre Lamond and the affectionately called Charlie Spork worked hand in hand, with support of the board of directors to transform the company into a multinational and world-class semiconductor concern. Immediately after becoming CEO, Spork started an historic price war among semiconductor companies, which then trimmed the number of competitors in the field. Among the casualties to exit the semiconductor business were General Electric and Westinghouse. Cost control, overhead reduction and a focus on profits implemented by Spork was the key element to National surviving the price war and subsequently in 1981 becoming the first semiconductor company to reach the $1 billion annual sales mark. However, the foundation that made National successful was its expertise in analog electronics, TTL and MOSFET integrated circuit technologies. As they had while employed in Fairchild, Spork and Lemon directed National Semiconductor towards the growing industrial and commercial markets and to rely less on military and aerospace contracts. Those decisions coupled with inflationary growth and use of computers provided the market for the expansion of National. Meanwhile, sources of funds associated with Sprague coupled with creative structuring of cash flow buffering due to Spork and Lemon provided the financing required for that expansion. Lemon and Spork had also managed to attract and extract substantial funds to finance the expansion. Among Spork's cost control efforts was his attraction towards low-cost labor and outsourcing of labor. National Semiconductor was among the pioneers in the semiconductor industry to invest in facilities to perform final manufacturing operations of integrated circuits in developing countries, especially in Southeast Asia. National Semiconductor's manufacturing improvements under Spork had not been enabled by emphasis on process innovation but on improving and standardizing processes already established by other companies like Fairchild and Texas Instruments, as well as by frequent raiding to hire from Fairchild's pool of talents. Weaknesses of Spork's leadership. National Semiconductor under Spork was not particularly invested in marketing strategies, even though it had the vision to launch itself into new and apparent opportunities in the consumer market. Spork had applied strategies that made National Semiconductor function as a low-cost mass manufacturer of semiconductor commodities. It seems that companies like Sony of Japan and Swatch of Switzerland understood that the consumer market is much less a commodities market where low cost of products does not always equal demand for such products. A few key executives and engineers left the company in 1981. Among them was Pierre Lemond, who had been the chief IC designer. Robert Swanson's leaving the company in the same year to found Linear Technology was another indication of the appropriateness of organizational strategies of National Semiconductor under Spork. For 13 of 14 years at National, I was a gung-ho guy. Then, the company started to get big. I kept looking at all the companies whose butts we'd been kicking. And then National started organizing itself like them. It was frustrating. Swanson said in the May 13, 1991 business journal San Jose. Spork's strategy of outsourcing sales to external sources meant National Semiconductor did not have sufficient or responsive resources to respond to requests from innovators, inventors and academic research, which would have been helpful in the technological innovation boom of the 1980s. National Semiconductor's lack and loss of innovation meant it was producing products that were easily copied and reproducible. It may have been the cheapest manufacturer in the United States, but it was not the cheapest compared to the Asian manufacturers. This weakness in National Semiconductor was evident in its failure to compete during the globalization of Japanese semiconductor companies in the 1980s, followed by the Taiwanese and South Koreans. Leadership under Gilbert F. Amelio. On May 27, 1991, Charles E. Spork was replaced by Gilbert F. Amelio as CEO and President. Amelio was then president of Rockwell International Semiconductor Division and had a Ph.D. in physics from Georgia Institute of Technology. Amelio had also been formerly employed at Fairchild. Amelio was faced with a company plagued with overcapacity and shrinking market share. Amelio found that, just prior to his taking helm, despite having spent $1 billion over the last 5 years on research and development, National Semiconductor had a disappointing record in new products. The business section of the New York Times January 11, 1991 reflected the overcapacity generated by Spork that had to be inherited by Amelio. Amelio disposed of the non-core products and assets in which National Semiconductor had no market motivation or expertise and turned the company towards its core expertise, analog semiconductors. National Semiconductor under Amelio emphasized on reduction of cost of sales, improving capacity utilization, scrap reduction and cycle time reduction. Redundant facilities were sold and consolidated. With the progress of restructuring, National Semiconductor increased revenues each year. In 1994, National Semiconductor under Amelio posted record net revenues of $2.29 billion. It was also a time when U.S. semiconductor companies had regained market leadership. Amelio introduced benchmarking to evaluate productivity, restructured marketing strategies and reorganized management by introducing modern management practices and workplace environments. Amelio divided products into two divisions, Standard Products Group which comprised low-margin, logic and memory chips, commodity products which were more susceptible to cyclical demands and through which National Semiconductor had matured, and Communications and Computing Group which comprised high-margin, value-added analog and mixed-signal chips. Amelio's thus division of products seemed to prepare National Semiconductor for the eventual disposal of low-margin commodity products, which came to fruition later with the sale of a reconstituted Fairchild. National Semiconductor under Amelio chose to build a brand new 8-inch wafer fabrication plant in South Portland, Maine. It chose to divest itself from its then somewhat new plant in Migdal HaEm, Israel, which became Tower Semiconductor. In 1995, Amelio was elected to be the chairman of the board of directors of National Semiconductor. In 1996, Amelio accepted invitation from Apple Computer, a customer of National Semiconductor, to join its board of directors. Troubles at Apple later prompted the board to invite Amelio to take on the position of CEO, which he accepted in February 1996. National Semiconductor announced the resignation of Amelio as the company's president, chairman and chief executive officer on February 2, 1996. Leadership under Brian Halla, National Semiconductor announced the appointment of Brian Halla as its chairman, president and CEO on May 3, 1996. Halla was then the head of LSI Logic Products Division. Prior to LSI, he had been with Intel for 14 years. Halla reinforced Amelio's emphasis on the expertise of National Semiconductor in analog technology. He also was, on occasions, an evangelist for analog technology. However, he found that National Semiconductor under Amelio had insufficient product offerings. Halla embarked on a diversification into personal computer and graphics business. He advocated PC on a chip as a business direction for National Semiconductor. During his tenure at LSI, LSI had successfully applied similar concepts. However, LSI had steered clear of getting involved with PC technologies that would make it a competitor with Intel. Halla held the vision that information appliances would succeed the personal computer as a trend. He predicted that IAs would overtake sales of PCs by the year 2000. To achieve the goal, National Semiconductor started acquiring companies that would provide the technological complements to do so. Among the acquisitions were Cirrus Logic Incorporated's Pico Power business, for its specialized expertise in small form-factor devices. Mediamatics Incorporated, which makes multimedia connectivity products. Future Integrated Systems Incorporated, a PC graphics company. Gulbranson Incorporated, a digital audio technology maker. Comcore Semiconductor Incorporated, a maker of digital signal processing for LANs. Cyrix, the maker of Intel x86 clones. On March 11, 1997, National Semiconductor Corporation announced the $550 million sale of a reconstituted Fairchild to the management of Fairchild with the backing of Sterling LLC, a unit of Citicorp Venture Capital. Fairchild carried with it what was mostly the Standard Products Group previously segregated by Amelio. Incidentally, The effective price of acquisition of Cyrix was also $550 million. On November 17, 1997, National Semiconductor and Cyrix announced the merger of the companies. Cyrix would become an autonomous wholly owned subsidiary. Halla had earlier emphasized that National was after the low-end CPU market as part of the system-on-a-chip pursuit and therefore would not place emphasis on Cyrix's current development of high-end 6x86MX design. However, Cyrix later announced that its merger with National Semiconductor would not change its development or marketing plans. The acquisition of an independent-minded Cyrix subsequently turned National Semiconductor from a collaborator into a competitor with Intel. National lost its business with Intel. Intel reinstated the relationship after the sale of Cyrix. The acquisition of Cyrix also carried with it a business obligation as well as technical constraints to use IBM Microelectronics division to fabricate the Cyrix chips, while National Semiconductor had plans to transfer their fabrication to its South Portland fab. National incurred huge losses due to its processor business and announced the sale of Cyrix to VIA in 1999. In 1999, National Semiconductor also put out feelers that it would sell, if not the whole then a majority stake of, its fabrication plant in South Portland, Maine. However, that did not come to fruition. On June 28, 2000, National Semiconductor and TSMC Taiwan signed an agreement that would allow transfer of advanced fabrication technologies from TSMC to the National Semiconductor fabrication plant in South Portland, Maine. On March 11, 2009, National announced plans to close its assembly and test plant in Suzhou, China, and its wafer fabrication plant in Arlington, Texas. On October 9, 2009, Brian Halla announced his retirement as National unregistered trademark CEO. He remains executive chairman. The company promoted Donald McLeod, who had previously served as the Campania unregistered trademark president and chief operating officer, to CEO. Leadership under Donald McLeod, Don McLeod became National Semiconductor unregistered trademark chief executive officer on November 30, 2009. He was named chairman of the board on May 31, 2010. Acquisition by Texas Instruments. On April 4, 2011, Texas Instruments announced that it had agreed to buy National Semiconductor for $6.5 billion in cash. Texas Instruments paid $25 per share of National Semiconductor stock, an 80% premium over the April 4, 2011 closing share price of $14.07. The deal made Texas Instruments one of the world's largest makers of analog technology components. On September 19, 2011, the Chinese minister approved the merger, the last one needed. The companies formally merged on September 23, 2011. Manufacturing locations. National Semiconductor also had operations in Migdal HaEmek, Israel. National Semiconductor had 6-inch wafer fabrication operations there. In 1993, National Semiconductor divested to retain 19% ownership of the plant. The plant in Migdal HaEmek, Israel is now constituted as Tower Semiconductor of Israel. Products: analog circuits, operational amplifiers, buffers, comparators, integrated circuits, regulators, voltage references. Audio circuits, microcontrollers, network products, data converters, interface circuits, display technology, temperature sensors, symbol switcher, history of National Semiconductor logo and product identification. The following picture excerpts illustrate the history of identification marks of National Semiconductor. See also: NS320XX, Nebraska, 2000, Hitachi Data Systems, Bob Pease, designer of the LM331 and LM337 among others, Bob Widler, inventor of the Widler current source, list of LM series integrated circuits, list of semiconductor fabrication plants, references. McLeod changes focus to revenue growth at National Times Europe, March 12, 2010. 1. External links, official site, official news releases, National Semiconductor at chipdb.org, National Semiconductor at datasheetcatalog.com, Electronic News, SCRA properly authentic bond certificates.